Welcome back. Thanks again for joining us for another episode as we are continuing in our verse-by-verse study through the book of Romans. If you're following along with us, we are in Romans chapter number 9, and we're going to pick up where we left off a few days ago. We've missed a couple of days in posting some episodes, and so we're going to catch up with that. But we're in the book of Romans chapter 9. We're going to jump in to verse number 24 in a second. We'll go back to 23 just for a little bit of context to give us an understanding of what's being stated here. But again, what we're looking at is a chapter in the book of Romans that is often used, I think, out of context to prove a stronger-handed view of the sovereignty of God. I'm in full belief that God is completely sovereign. But I believe in his sovereignty, he has given us a free will. This includes in the act of salvation. I believe God is involved in salvation. I believe a man cannot be saved except the Father draw him. But I believe we do have a choice. And many aspects of the Reformed thinking say you don't. God is chosen ahead of time, and you use these passages for that. So we're going to jump in a little bit and show that I believe even from Old Testament, God's intention was to expand beyond just one group, and how we can even see from this chapter it was not this truth. And I believe that as you dig further into chapter 9, you're going to find that some of these theological thinkings of this my stronger view of election are disproved by the verses we're going to look at when we understand them. So again, Romans chapter 9, verse 23, kind of for context, that he, the Lord, might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory. Now, again, a lot of people go to that verse and they see these are the ones he's chosen ahead of time, before salvation, before the world began, and these are the ones that are going to get saved. And depending on what version of Reform you think, they don't have a choice, or however it would work when it comes to salvation. Let's continue to read to find out in context what it means. Verse 24: even us, whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. In that verse, he clarifies he's not speaking that. What he's saying is, in the Old Testament, his attention was to the Jewish people, but his plan was to expand out to the Gentiles, and he then quotes Hosea and Isaiah from the Old Testament to prove this. He says, verse 25, he says, also in Hosea, I believe it's chapter 2, I will call them my people who were not my people, and her beloved who was not beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called the sons of the living God. Here's what he's talking about. He's referencing the Gentiles. He said, I will call the people who are not my people. He's talking about Gentiles. So in the Old Testament, the idea was to come to God, you had to come through Judaism. You had to come through the Jewish people, and because they were God's chosen people. And he says, my ultimate plan, long-term, he prophesied that in the book of Hosea, my ultimate long-term plan is that one day I will call non-Jewish people my people. And again, the term Gentile refers to anybody who is not a Jew. That would be me. And again, if you're not of Jewish descent, that would be you. And what he's saying in this is that he's opening up this gospel to everyone. Again, so I think it easily points out the fact that God is not picking and choosing. Please remember, a lot of the teaching, especially in the book of Romans and election, references national election to the nation of Israel, which is true. But God said long-term that is going to break, and he says that while there still is chosen people, he said, I'm going to expand it to Gentiles. And then he explains in the next verse a little bit of what he does with the people of Israel. In verse number 27, he goes back to the book of Isaiah. This also cries out concerning Israel. Also cries out concerning Israel. Though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, though there be literally innumerable when it comes to the people of Israel, the remnant, or only the remnant, will be saved. For he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. Now, here's what he's referencing. He's like, even though the number of the people will be as the sand of the sea. Now, you go back, and really, the reason he's using this phrase, in my opinion, is you can go back to the promise to Abraham. If you remember, Abraham was promised to be the father of a great nation. Later, Jacob was promised that as well. But Abraham was promised. He knew it would come through a son. He knew he'd have one son, and through that one son, God would make him a father of this great nation. And one of the terms used to describe this was that your people be as the sand of the sea. I'm sorry, not exactly the phrase. Yeah, the sands of the sea. But you go out to the shore. You go out to the coast. You go look at the sand. You can't number them. They're tiny, and there's millions of them. And he's like, this will be your people, which is true of the Israeli people, Jewish people. And he's saying that. So he uses a description to remind people of a term used for Abraham. And then he says, unfortunately, even though there'll be that many, only a remnant of those people will be saved. Now, is this by force? Is this God's going to choose? No, it goes back to the idea of vessels for destruction, vessels for mercy. It goes down to a choice. Israel, if you go back to the book of Judges, in the book of Judges, there is a phrase that years ago I heard used, I thought was well. It's called the cycle of sin. The Jewish people would enjoy God's supernatural blessing because they were worshiping him and honoring him. And then after a period of time, they would fall into sin. And really the biggest sin was they would follow other gods. And they didn't necessarily always leave God, they would just add more gods. That's why in the Ten Commandments, you have no other God before me. One of the ways they justified their actions was, well, we still have Jehovah. He's just one of our gods. He says, no, I will be your only God. I am a jealous God, which is very true and very valid. So when they looked at this, in that cycle of sin, you'd see they would choose other gods, they'd go away, and they knew what would happen. God promised, I mean, we read this in Chronicles and other places where God said, if you will run away, this is what will happen. So they were sold into slavery. They become a punishment. Slavery, often famine, and they would get into some level of captivity or punishment. And then after a period of time, they would repent of their sin. They'd call back on God. God would bring them back through a judge, through supernatural, the work of a judge. Gideon was the name that many people are familiar with. It was 300 men fighting off the Midianites, and they would come back and now and again enjoy this great supernatural blessing from Jehovah God. This cycle was usually around about 200 years. And this would happen over and over. That is the history of the Jewish people. It's still true of us. You know, we can find a tendency to do that. Individually, it doesn't always take 200 years, but you understand the point. We can go through that. This cycle of sin. But here's what you see. Israel it was known throughout the time to be stubborn and go against God, no matter how much God had put his hand of blessing upon them. So he says, there's so many of them, the remnant will be saved. Why? For he will finish the work of it and cut it short in righteousness. That God's righteousness demanded that he deal with sin, and Israel's refusal to follow that demanded judgment. And so that would happen. Here's what he means by that. Verse 29, as I said before, unless the Lord of Sabaoth had left us a sea, we would have become like Sodom and we would have become like Gomorrah. Now, what's he talking about that? Sodom and Gomorrah were judged for their actions. They were wiped off the map for their actions. And what Isaiah was saying was, if it weren't for the grace and mercy of God, we would be wiped off the map like Sodom and Gomorrah. So what you see here is because of Israel's choice, God chose to add the Gentiles, not just the Jewish people, but brought punishment on them because of their action. And he said, frankly, because of our actions, we deserve to be treated like Sodom and Gomorrah, but because God is so gracious to us as a nation, that's not what's happening. And that's one of the things that we see here. This is, a lot of times you can look and you say, God's righteousness, God's judgment can see as bad, but think about what God could do. What do we truly deserve? And when you see what we truly deserve, then you see that, man, God has really been gracious and righteous. I mean, we deserve hell. The wages of sin is death. But through the gift of God, God has offered us eternity in heaven through his Son, not because of what we've done, but because of what he has done. So we look at this passage, we see the grace of God to move to the Gentiles, and all people are offered salvation. And then we see that God could choose to be harsh, but even in his righteousness, he shows his mercy. And through his judgment, there's always mercy seen. And we know in end days that will happen. We get to the end of human history, we're going to see that God's judgment will be brought out on everyone. That's why there's a place called hell. But God has, in his long suffering, given us many, many years as he strives to bring as many into his family through the gospel as possible. So today, look to that mercy. Look to that grace. We know what we deserve. But we're offering mercy, we're offered grace. And Ephesians says, for by grace, his grace, we are saved through our faith in him. Not of works, not anything we do, lest we should boast. So we look at this and we thank God for what he's done and thank God for what he's doing. And if you've not put your faith in him, I challenge you to do that today. This is, again, another picture of God's great mercy. And may that be an encouragement that no matter our past, no matter our choices, God is always so gracious and merciful to us. We do appreciate the privilege you've given to be part of your day, to be part of your life. I hope this is an encouragement. Stick with us as we'll jump in here next time and pick up where we left off. I'll talk a little more about this and God's working with Israel as we can finish up Romans chapter 9. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.